Lillian Carter never imagined that the same hand she once taught to pray would be the reason she was now bound to a wooden chair. Across the expansive, cold marble of the penthouse, Park Soo-jin sits draped in red silk, swirling a glass of vintage Merlot as if she's watching a boring play rather than a kidnapping. "Where is the ledger, Lillian?" Soo-jin's voice is a sharp blade wrapped in velvet. She leans in, the scent of expensive perfume clashing with the metallic tang of fear. "Tell me now, or I'll make sure Musiak finds only a memory when he returns." Lillian lifts her chin, her gaze as steady as the Bronzeville streets that forged her. "Child," she says, her voice low and unshakable, "you haven't just crossed a line." She pauses, studying Soo-jin with the quiet patience of someone who has seen storms come and go. "You've invited a monster back into this house." Then, the heavy thud of the mahogany door echoes through the silence. A tall, commanding figure in a sharp navy blue suit freezes in the entryway. The leather briefcase in Musiak's hand slips, hitting the floor with a hollow sound that signals the end of the world as Soo-jin knows it. Musiak is home 3 hours early. His eyes settle on the wine glass, then his wife's panicked face, and finally, the ropes cutting into the woman who saved his life when he was a starving orphan. For a moment, the entire room stops breathing. In that heartbeat, the polished CEO vanishes. The ruthless syndicate boss, the son who protects his own, takes his place. Musiak slowly walks forward, his eyes dark, unreadable. Then he turns to the woman tied to the chair. His voice is calm. "Too calm. Mama, tell me something." The room tightens. "Do you want justice?" He glances toward Soo-jin, whose face has gone ghost pale. "Or mercy?" Because everyone in that room knows one terrifying truth. Whatever Lillian Carter says next will decide whether Musiak's wife walks out of this penthouse alive. But how did the most feared man in the city walk into his own sanctuary, to find his wife dismantling his soul? To understand the blood that's about to be spilled, we have to go back exactly 48 hours. Before we dive into the fallout, make sure to hit that subscribe button and like this video. And I want to know in the comments, if you were in Musiak's shoes and you walked into this room, what would be your first move? Stay tuned, because this story is just getting started. Bronzeville in the early 90s wasn't just a neighborhood, it was a living, breathing machine of rhythm and struggle. The air always smelled of diesel from the city buses and the sweet, heavy scent of Lillian's soul kitchen. Lillian Carter was the heart of that street, a woman whose hands were permanently dusted with flour and whose eyes saw everything. One rainy Tuesday, while the sky was the color of a bruised plum, Lillian went out to the alley to toss a heavy bag of trash into the bin. That was when she saw him. He was a scrap of a boy, no more than 7 or 8 years old, huddled behind a stack of wooden crates. He was drenched to the bone, his oversized jacket clinging to a frame so thin it looked like a collection of sticks. His skin was pale, almost translucent under the flickering street lamp, and his dark eyes were wide with a terror so deep it looked like glass. He didn't move. He didn't beg. He just stared at her with the haunting stillness of a creature that had already accepted its end. "Lord have mercy," Lillian whispered, the rain matting her hair. She didn't reach for him. She knew better than to startle a cornered soul. Instead, she propped the back door open and retreated inside. Minutes later, she returned with a cracked ceramic bowl. It was filled with steaming grits, topped with a thick slab of butter and a side of warm cornbread. She set it on the wet asphalt, 3 feet away from his hiding spot, and stepped back. The boy's nose twitched. The scent of real food seemed to physically pull him forward. He lunged for the bowl, eating with his bare hands, sobbing silently as the warmth hit his stomach. Lillian watched from the doorway, her heart breaking for the boy who spoke no English but understood the universal language of hunger. Day after day, the boy returned. She eventually learned his name was Musiak, a child of immigrants who had fallen through the cracks of a cold city. She didn't call social services. She had seen too many boys get lost in that system. Instead, she brought him inside. She sat him at the back booth, gave him a warm cloth for his face, and taught him his first English words over plates of fried chicken and collard greens. But what Lillian didn't realize at the time was that the quiet boy watching everything from that diner booth was also learning something else. He watched how men treated her with respect, how the neighborhood protected her, how a single woman with nothing but courage and kindness could command loyalty stronger than fear. Sometimes, when a customer raised his voice or acted out of line, young Musiak would look up from his plate with those same glassy eyes, studying the moment, memorizing it, as if he were silently asking himself a question he couldn't yet put into words. How far should a man go to protect the person who saved him? Years later, that question would return to him in the most terrifying moment of his life. She gave him a place to sleep in the small apartment above the diner and a reason to keep his head up. In the rough and tumble world of Bronzeville, she became his shield. She didn't know then that the small, starving boy she saved from the rain would grow up to rule an empire, or that he would one day be the only thing standing between her and a world that wanted to erase her. To her, he wasn't a future boss. He was just her son. To the outside world, Park Soo-jin was the personification of modern Korean elegance, a porcelain doll curated for the high society galas of Chicago. But inside the sprawling, minimalist penthouse she shared with Han Musiak, she felt like a queen forced to share her throne with a ghost. Standing in the center of her Italian-designed kitchen, Soo-jin watched through narrowed eyes as Lillian Carter moved with frustrating familiarity among the professional-grade appliances. The air, which should have smelled of expensive diptyque candles and filtered oxygen, was currently heavy with the thick, invasive scent of slow-simmered oxtails and garlic. To Musiak, that smell was home. To Soo-jin, it was a vulgar reminder of the gutter her husband had crawled out of. She loathed the way Lillian touched the marble countertops with her weathered, flour-dusted hands. Every time the older woman laughed, a deep, resonant sound that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards, Soo-jin felt a physical pang of irritation. It was an insult to the life they were supposed to be leading. They were royalty now. They dealt in international shipping, offshore accounts, and blood-stained ledgers. There was no room in this sleek glass and steel fortress for the sentimental junk of a Bronzeville diner. "You know, Musiak is a man of international standing now, Lillian," Soo-jin said, her voice dropping to a low, icy hum as she stepped closer. "He doesn't need to be reminded of the days he was starving. He doesn't need the smell of poverty clinging to his bespoke suits." Lillian didn't even turn around from the stove. She simply stirred the pot, the wooden spoon rhythmically hitting the side. "Food isn't just about hunger, child. It's about who kept you fed when no one else was looking. Musiak remembers that, even if you've forgotten how to be human." The child bit stung more than a slap. Soo-jin's jaw tightened until it ached. She looked at her manicured nails, then at the heavy, cast-iron pot Lillian used, an antique eyesore that ruined the aesthetic of the entire kitchen. In Soo-jin's mind, Lillian wasn't just a mother figure. She was a witness. She was the only person who knew that the great Han Musiak had once been a boy who cried in the rain. As long as Lillian was in the house, Soo-jin would never truly own him. She would always be second to a woman who possessed a loyalty that money couldn't buy. And that thought gnawed at her far more than the smell of garlic ever could. Because deep down, Soo-jin understood something dangerous. If Musiak were ever forced to choose between the woman who shared his bed and the woman who saved his life, she wasn't entirely sure she would win. That uncertainty was a humiliation she refused to live with. As she turned to leave the room, the scent of the spices followed her like an unwanted shadow. "Enjoy your kitchen while you can, old woman," Soo-jin thought, her eyes flashing with a predatory light. "Because by the time the sun sets tomorrow, I'm going to make sure Musiak never has to choose between us again. I'll make the choice for him. And when that moment comes, we'll finally see what matters more to the great Han Musiak: power, or the past he swore he would never forget." The morning of the departure was heralded by a cold, gray fog that rolled off Lake Michigan, clinging to the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse like a shroud. Han Musiak stood in the foyer, the sharp lines of his charcoal suit reflecting the absolute discipline of his life. He checked his watch, a habit of a man who measured success in seconds, before turning to his wife. Sujin stood by the door, the picture of a devoted partner. She wore a cream-colored silk robe, her face a mask of soft, manufactured concern. She reached out, straightening his lapel with a lingering touch that felt more like a brand than an endearment. 48 hours is a long time for the house to feel so empty, Musiak, she murmured, her voice tilting with just the right amount of longing. Musiak offered a rare, thin smile. He leaned down and pressed a brief, firm kiss to her forehead. I'll be back before you've had time to miss me. Keep things quiet while I'm in Seoul. The Morello family is looking for any sign of a crack in our foundation. I know how to handle the foundation, Sujin replied, her eyes dipping for a fraction of a second toward the hallway that led to the kitchen, where Lillian was already humming a gospel tune over a pot of coffee. Musiak turned to the two men standing like stone pillars near the elevator, Min-ho and Di-sung. They were part of his elite inner circle, men he had personally vetted and paid triple the industry standard, or so he believed. He didn't see the slight, almost imperceptible nod Di-sung gave to Sujin as Musiak turned his back. He didn't see the way their hands rested a little too comfortably on their holsters, not to protect the house from the outside, but to secure it from within. Min-ho, stay on the perimeter. Di-sung, you're on the door, Musiak commanded, his voice echoing with the weight of a king. Lillian's safety is the priority. If a single hair is harmed, don't bother waiting for my return. Understood, boss, they replied in unison, their voices flat and rehearsed. But before stepping into the elevator, Musiak paused. For a brief moment, he glanced down the hallway toward the kitchen. He could hear Lillian humming softly to herself, the same gospel tune she used to sing in the diner all those years ago. The sound pulled something deep in his chest. Min-ho, he added quietly, his voice lowering. If anything ever forces you to choose between protecting my empire or protecting her. He let the sentence hang in the air. Then he finished it. You protect her. The guards nodded again. But the look that passed between them after Musiak turned away said something very different. With a final nod to his wife, Musiak stepped into the private elevator. As the doors slid shut, the last thing he saw was Sujin's elegant silhouette, her hand raised in a delicate wave. He felt a strange, cold prickle at the base of his neck, a residual instinct from his days on the streets of Bronzeville, but he brushed it off as travel fatigue. He was at the height of his power, surrounded by his own men, in a fortress of his own making. He had no way of knowing that the moment the elevator hit the lobby, the men he trusted would turn the locks, cut the external feed, and look to his wife for their next set of orders. The shepherd was gone, and the wolves had already been paid in gold to look the other way. Because in this house, loyalty was about to be tested in the most brutal way possible. And soon, Musiak himself would have to answer the same question he unknowingly left behind in that hallway. When the moment comes, who do you protect? The silence that followed the elevator's descent was not the peaceful quiet of a home at rest. It was the heavy, suffocating stillness of a trap snapping shut. For a moment, nothing moved. Then the penthouse changed. Lillian Carter stood in the vast kitchen, her hand frozen on the handle of a cast-iron skillet, when the familiar rhythm of the house suddenly died. The soft hum of ventilation units faded. The quiet footsteps of staff disappeared. Even the distant city noise seemed muffled, as if the walls themselves had decided to listen. She felt it instantly, the way people who had survived hard lives always did. Something was wrong. Out in the hallway, the two young housemaids, girls who usually hurried about with nervous smiles and lowered eyes, were being escorted toward the service exit by Di-sung. Not speaking. Not protesting. Just walking. No explanations were given. No instructions were exchanged. They were simply removed. Lillian slowly set the skillet down, and wiped her hands on the front of her apron before stepping into the hallway. "Di-sung," she called out calmly. "Where are those girls going? It's far too early for their shift to end." The bodyguard did not answer. He stood by the massive, reinforced doors of the penthouse with his back toward her. One thick hand rested against the security panel. A second later, clack, clack, clack. The electronic deadbolts engaged one by one with deep metallic thuds that echoed down the hallway like the closing of a vault. The sound crawled down Lillian's spine. "The help has been compensated for their early departure, Lillian." The voice floated out from the living room. Cold, sharp, stripped of the melodic sweetness it usually carried. Lillian turned toward the sound slowly. She walked down the hallway and stepped into the grand living room, and stopped. Park Soo-jin stood near the floor-to-ceiling windows, overlooking the gray Chicago skyline. But she no longer looked like the gentle wife who had waved goodbye to her husband minutes earlier. The silk robe was gone. In its place was a striking, blood-red evening gown that clung to her figure like liquid fire. The color glowed against the dim afternoon sky outside, making her look almost theatrical, like an actress stepping onto a stage. In her hand, she lazily swirled a glass of deep red Merlot. The wine caught the chandelier light. For a strange moment, it looked almost like blood. "Soo-jin," Lillian said carefully, studying her, "what is this?" Her voice remained steady, but something deep inside her chest had already begun to tighten. "Musiak said to keep things quiet while he was gone." She glanced at the sealed doors behind her. "This doesn't feel quiet." Her eyes returned to Soo-jin. "This feels like a funeral." For a brief moment, the room held its breath. Then Soo-jin smiled. Not politely. Not nervously. Predatorily. "In a way," she said softly, lifting the glass to her lips, "it is." She took a slow sip. "The funeral of a delusion." She gestured slowly around the luxurious penthouse. The imported marble floors, the modern art sculptures, the towering glass walls. "Musiak believes he can blend two worlds that should never touch," she continued. "The dirt of the streets and the gold of this life." Her eyes moved back to Lillian. "He believes he can keep a dishwasher in a palace and call it family." The insult hung in the air. But Lillian didn't react. She simply folded her arms and watched the younger woman with calm, patient eyes. Soo-jin's smile twitched slightly. Then her voice hardened. "But I manage his image. I deal with investors, politicians, other families." Her tone sharpened with resentment. "And they all ask the same question." Her eyes narrowed. "Why is there an old diner cook walking around the home of the most powerful man in the city?" The words dripped with classist venom. But beneath it, there was something else. Fear. Because Lillian Carter was more than a cook. She was history. She was loyalty. She was the one person in the world who knew what Han Musiak had been before the power. And that made her dangerous. Soo-jin took another slow sip of wine, watching closely as Lillian's chest rose and fell. "You see," she continued softly, "as long as you remain in this house, I will never truly own my husband." The room went still. Then she lowered the wine glass. "So today we correct that." For the first time, Lillian's eyes sharpened. "Child," she said quietly, "whatever foolishness you're planning, you should stop now." But Soo-jin didn't blink. Instead, she spoke without taking her eyes off the older woman. "Di-sung." The bodyguard stepped forward. "Bring the chair." The words echoed like a judge delivering a sentence. Lillian barely had time to take a step backward before the heavy hand of the man Musiak trusted more than his own shadow landed firmly on her shoulder. His grip tightened. And in that moment, Lillian understood. The guards had been bought. The house had been sealed. And Musiak was thousands of miles away. The silence of the penthouse was broken by a slow, scraping sound. A heavy wooden chair dragged across the dark oak floor. The sound echoed through the enormous room like the opening note of a nightmare. A nightmare Lillian Carter never believed she would face. In the home of the boy she once saved from the rain. The thick, abrasive bite of the hemp rope felt foreign against the soft wool of Lillian Carter's sweater. D-Sung worked with a practiced, almost surgical efficiency. His large hands moved quickly, looping the rope around her arms, her chest, the back of the heavy oak chair. Each knot tightened with quiet precision until the wood beneath her creaked under the strain. Lillian didn't struggle. She understood something men like D-Sung often forgot. In a house built on high-end security and low-end betrayal, brute strength was rarely the weapon that mattered most. Patience was. Faith was. And loyalty was stronger than any rope. Across the room, Park Soo-jin slowly circled the chair. The polished marble floor reflected the deep crimson of her gown as she moved, the soft rustle of silk sounding almost like a snake sliding through grass. She stopped directly in front of Lillian. The hem of her expensive dress brushed against the older woman's sensible shoes. For a moment, Soo-jin simply studied her. Then she leaned down until their faces were only inches apart. "Musiak is a man of many layers," she whispered. Her voice was smooth, almost gentle. "But he is also a man of secrets." Her eyes sharpened. "And powerful men never trust banks alone." She straightened slightly. "There is a ledger, Lillian, a physical one, small, black, leather-bound." Her fingers slowly traced the air, as if outlining the object. "It contains everything, the Morello accounts, offshore holdings, silent partners, hidden roots." Her gaze hardened. "The entire empire." She tilted her head. "And I know he gave it to you." The room fell silent. For a moment, the only sound was the distant hum of Chicago traffic far below the penthouse. Then Lillian finally looked up. Her breathing was shallow but steady. "He gave me his heart to keep safe, child," she said quietly. Her voice was calm, unshaken. "Anything else is just paper and ink." Crack! The slap landed suddenly. Sharp. Violent. The sound ricocheted off the marble walls like a gunshot. Lillian's head snapped to the side. A thin line of blood appeared at the corner of her mouth where her lip had split. But she didn't cry out. She didn't even flinch. Slowly, she turned her face back. Soo-jin stood there, her expression strangely calm. Not furious. Not wild. Just bored. "Don't play the martyr with me," she said coldly. Her voice had lost all softness now. "You are a relic, Lillian." Her eyes swept over the older woman with clear disdain. "A leftover piece of a life Musiak has already outgrown." She stepped closer. "If you tell me where the ledger is, I'll let D-Sung drive you to a bus station." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "You can return to your little grease-stained diner in Bronzeville, serve your fried chicken, say your prayers." She leaned closer. "And forget this life ever existed." Then her hand moved. Her manicured fingers wrapped around the rope across Lillian's chest. And pulled. The fibers dug deep into her skin. "If you do." Her voice hardened into something ugly. "I'll make sure the last thing you feel is the regret of failing the boy you claim to love so much." The words lingered. Then Lillian closed her eyes. The penthouse disappeared. The marble. The red dress. The ropes. All of it faded. Instead, she saw a rainy alley in Bronzeville. A tiny boy. Shivering. Starving. Looking at a bowl of grits like it was the first miracle he had ever seen. She felt his small fingers clutching her hand. "Lord," Lillian murmured softly. Her voice was low, but it carried a strange, steady strength that filled the room. "Cover him with your wings. Keep his heart from turning to stone in the cold of this world." She took a slow breath. Let him find his way home. Her voice softened even more. Not for my sake, but for his. Are you even listening to me? Sujin snapped, suddenly grabbing Lillian's chin and forcing her head upward. Their eyes locked. For the first time, Sujin hesitated. Because what she saw there wasn't fear. It wasn't anger either. It was pity. Quiet. Deep. Terrifying. I'm listening, Sujin, Lillian said gently. But you're the one who's deaf. Sujin's grip tightened. You think these ropes hold me? Lillian's voice grew steadier. I've survived things you couldn't even imagine. She leaned forward slightly despite the restraints. And my son. A small smile touched the corner of her mouth. My Musiak. Her voice dropped to a whisper. He's already on his way. Sujin's eyes flashed. I can feel the storm coming. Then Lillian looked directly into her eyes. And honey. A pause. You didn't bring an umbrella. Rage twisted Sujin's face instantly. Her arm shot upward. She raised her hand to strike again. But suddenly, the air in the room changed. It was subtle at first. A strange shift in pressure. Like the moment before a thunderstorm breaks. Then, ding! The soft chime of the private elevator echoed through the hallway. The sound froze everyone in place. Because it came 3 hours earlier than it was supposed to. And somewhere deep in the penthouse, a storm had just arrived. The conference room in Seoul was a temple of glass and tempered steel. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked a city that glittered endlessly beneath the night sky, its lights pulsing like a living organism that never slept. Inside the room, everything was immaculate, polished black floors, a long obsidian table, and 12 powerful men seated in perfect order. But for Han Musiak, the air suddenly felt thin. He sat at the head of the table, his posture calm, controlled, almost regal. Around him, the elders of the Kwon Syndicate spoke in low, calculated tones, discussing cargo routes, percentages, and territorial influence across the Pacific trade network. To them, it was business. Numbers. Power. But Musiak's attention had begun to drift. His expression remained perfectly impassive, the disciplined mask of a man who had built an empire from nothing. Yet his thumb moved absently across the surface of the tablet resting beside him. A habit. A quiet ritual. Every few hours, no matter where he was in the world, he checked one thing. Home. He opened the encrypted home cam feed, connected to the Chicago penthouse. Normally it brought him peace. The quiet hallway lights. The distant movement of staff. Sometimes Lillian in the kitchen, humming an old gospel tune. Sometimes Sujin, reading near the windows. Small signs that the one place he trusted in the world was still standing. Tonight the feed flickered to life. At first glance, everything looked normal. The living room glowed under the warm amber light of the chandeliers. The fireplace cast soft shadows across the marble floor. Lillian's favorite armchair sat near the window. Empty. A shadow moved slowly near the fireplace. Musiak stared at the screen. 5 seconds passed. Then 10. Something in his chest tightened. His eyes narrowed slightly. The same sharp eyes that had spent years studying enemies, memorizing tells, detecting the smallest weaknesses in men who believed themselves untouchable. He focused on the screen again. The shadow moved past the fireplace. Exactly the same arc. Exactly the same speed. Musiak's thumb froze on the tablet. A second later, a tiny digital artifact flickered near the corner of the frame. A microscopic pixel glitch. So small most people would have missed it. But Musiak didn't miss things like that. The feed wasn't live. It was a loop. A cold, visceral dread settled deep in his stomach. Not the fear of a businessman losing money. Not the anxiety of a deal collapsing. This was older than that. Primal. The same instinct he had felt as a child hiding behind trash cans in Bronzeville, while sirens screamed through the night. His security system was impenetrable. His encryption had been built by the best engineers money could buy. There was only one way to create a loop like that. It had to be done inside the house. Very slowly, Musiak lifted his eyes from the tablet. The elders were still speaking. The Busan corridor will give us a 40% increase in shipping efficiency, one of them said. Mr. Han. The voice cut through the room. An older man leaned slightly forward. Is there an issue with the proposal? Musiak didn't answer. He rose from his chair. Slowly, the heavy leather scraped across the floor with a low, dragging sound that silenced the entire room. 12 men stopped talking instantly. They watched him, because something had changed. The calm executive who had entered the room an hour earlier was gone. Musiak picked up his phone and quickly entered a coded sequence, bypassing the main penthouse system. If the cameras were compromised, he had one more safeguard. The emergency beacon. A tiny signal transmitter hidden inside the pendant Lillian wore around her neck, a gift he had insisted she keep with her at all times. The device activated. His phone waited, searching for the signal. 1 second. 2. 3. Nothing. The signal was being jammed. The room seemed to shrink around him. Musiak thought back to that morning. Sujin standing by the door, her hand adjusting his lapel. The softness of her voice. The perfection of her smile. Too perfect. His stomach turned cold. The meeting is over. The words came out low. Controlled. But underneath them was a growl that made every man in the room fall silent. No one argued. No one questioned him. Because the expression in Musiak's eyes was something few people had ever seen. Pure violence. He turned toward the door and began walking. Long, purposeful strides. The businessmen behind him remained frozen in their seats. The $1 million deal no longer mattered. The negotiations. The territory agreements. None of it mattered. The businessman had disappeared. In his place stood the orphan boy who had once eaten from a cracked bowl of grits in a diner kitchen. The boy who had been given a second life by one woman. And that boy had grown into a man capable of destroying cities. As he stepped into the hallway, his lead security officer rushed forward. Boss. Musiak didn't slow down. He only gave one order. Prepare the jet. His voice dropped lower. Colder. We're going home. A pause. Then the final word landed like a gunshot. Now. Somewhere across the ocean. A storm had already begun forming. And by the time Han Musiak returned to Chicago, someone was going to drown in it. The cabin of the Gulfstream G650 was a hollow, vibrating tube of pressurized tension as it tore through the night sky at Mach 0.9. Outside the oval windows, the Pacific was nothing but an endless black sheet, broken only by distant flashes of lightning along the horizon. Inside the aircraft, the lighting was dim and golden, the kind designed for comfort. But comfort had no place on this flight. Han Musiak didn't sit in the plush leather seats. He stood near the cockpit door, tall and motionless, his gaze locked onto the glowing radar display, as if sheer willpower alone could drag the jet across the ocean faster. This was not an official flight. Not one registered with the syndicate. Not one filed through any corporate system. The jet had been chartered through 3 shell companies and paid through an account that technically didn't exist. If his security network had truly been compromised, then every normal channel, every manifest, every airport alert would act like a beacon to whoever had set the trap. Tonight, Musiak was moving like a ghost. We aren't landing at O'Hare, he said suddenly. His voice cut through the cockpit like a blade. The pilot turned slightly in his seat. Redirect to the private airstrip in Gary. He leaned closer to the instrument panel. No radio contact until we're on the ground. A pause. Keep the transponder on the secondary frequency. The pilot hesitated. Through the windshield, dark storm clouds churned above the Great Lakes. "Sir, the weather over Indiana is unstable," he said cautiously. "High crosswinds, lightning activity. We might want to circle until—" Musiak didn't raise his voice. But the temperature in the cockpit dropped instantly. "I don't care if the sky is falling." His dark eyes lifted slowly. "Land the plane." The pilot swallowed and turned back to the controls. "Yes, sir." Behind them, the jet banked sharply, changing course toward the Midwest. Musiak stepped back into the cabin. The soft lights reflected off polished surfaces, but his focus had already shifted inward. Preparation. He removed his charcoal suit jacket and draped it across a seat. Underneath, his white dress shirt stretched over the shoulder holster strapped tightly against his ribs. With calm, deliberate movements, he reached inside. His sidearm slid free. He checked the magazine. Loaded. Then he pulled the slide back. Clack. The metallic sound echoed through the quiet cabin like the ticking of a clock counting down. This was no longer a business trip. He wasn't returning home as a CEO. He was returning as something far older and far more dangerous. His mind raced through possibilities. If the security cameras had been looped, then the house had already been breached. If the signal beacon in Lillian's pendant had been jammed, someone inside the penthouse had access to internal systems. That meant Sujin hadn't acted alone. He thought about the guards stationed at the door. Min Ho, Di Sung, men he had trusted with his life. Men he had trusted with hers. His jaw tightened. Then another thought cut deeper. Lillian's hands. Strong hands. Kind hands. Hands that had wiped rain from his face when he was a starving boy. Hands that had patched up his torn jackets and fed him warm food when the world had nothing to offer. He imagined those hands shaking. Or worse. Still, the rage that burned beneath his ribs felt alive now, like a furnace that kept the cold cabin air from touching him. The jet continued slicing through the storm. Musiak knew the landing plan would cost him time. Landing in Gary instead of O'Hare meant a 30-minute drive across the state line. But those 30 minutes would give him something far more valuable. Surprise. If Sujin had planned this carefully, she would be monitoring every arrival terminal in Chicago. Watching. Waiting. Expecting his name to appear on a flight list. Expecting the moment his car left the airport. She would never think to look for a black SUV tearing down Interstate 90 from an abandoned industrial airstrip. A crackle came over the intercom. 10 minutes to touchdown, the pilot announced. Musiak gripped the back of one of the leather seats. The plane had begun its descent. Outside the windows, the sky had turned violent. Rain lashed against the glass. Lightning ripped across the clouds, illuminating the cabin in brief flashes of white. The aircraft bucked against the Midwestern wind currents, shaking violently as it dropped lower. But Musiak didn't flinch. He didn't blink. He simply stood there. Silent. Focused. Because the storm outside the plane meant nothing compared to the one waiting inside him. He was the storm now. Moments later, the wheels slammed against the rain-slicked tarmac of the empty airstrip with a violent screech. The jet roared down the runway before slowing to a stop near a dimly lit hangar. The door had barely opened before Musiak was already moving. Rain hit his face the second he stepped outside. Black SUVs waited on the runway, engines running. His men were already out of the vehicles. Waiting. Musiak walked toward them without slowing. The hunt had begun. And somewhere in Chicago, someone had just run out of time. The silence inside the penthouse was absolute. It was the kind of silence that presses against your ears, thick and suffocating, like the air before a lightning strike. Then it shattered. The massive mahogany doors swung inward with a heavy, echoing thud. Han Musiak stepped inside. His navy blue suit jacket was gone, abandoned somewhere between the airport and the front door. His white dress shirt sleeves were rolled up, revealing forearms corded with hard muscle and tension. Rainwater still clung faintly to his hair. In his right hand, he carried a leather briefcase. It hung loosely at his side like a forgotten artifact from another life, a life that had ended the moment he saw the camera feed loop. For a moment, no one moved. Musiak didn't shout. He didn't rush forward. He simply stopped mid-step. His jaw tightened. His breathing slowed. His eyes widened slightly in what looked, for the briefest second, like shock. But the shock cooled almost instantly. What replaced it was far worse. A cold, crystalline rage. Across the room, Park Soo-jin froze on the velvet sofa. The glass of Merlot in her hand hovered halfway to her lips. The deep red liquid trembled slightly against the crystal. Her eyes flicked quickly toward the digital clock on the marble mantel. Then back to her husband. Her expression shifted from confusion to fear. "Musiak," she said weakly. Her voice sounded thin now, fragile in the enormous room. You weren't supposed to be home until tonight." Musiak didn't answer. He didn't even look at her. His gaze had already moved past her. Locked. Frozen. On the wooden chair placed in the center of the living room. He saw the ropes first. Thick hemp coils biting into worn fabric. Then he saw Lillian. Her shoulders slumped slightly with exhaustion. Her hands bound tight against the chair. But her chin was still lifted with quiet dignity. And there on her cheek was the faint bloom of a bruise. Something inside Musiak shifted. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just a quiet breaking sound somewhere deep in his chest. Then he began walking. Slowly. Each step measured. Controlled. Predatory. The polished marble floor reflected his approach as he crossed the room. He stopped beside the chair. The briefcase slipped from his hand and landed on the floor with a soft thud. The sound echoed strangely in the silent penthouse, like the strike of a judge's gavel. Musiak lowered himself to one knee in front of Lillian. For the first time since entering the room, his face softened. Just slightly. "I'm sorry, Mama," he whispered. His voice cracked faintly, the vulnerability cutting through the room like a knife. "I'm so sorry I let this into our home." Lillian looked down at him. Despite the ropes, despite the bruise, her eyes were calm, warm, proud. "I told her you were coming, son," she said gently. A faint smile touched her lips. "I told her the storm didn't need an invitation." Musiak's hands moved to the ropes. The same hands that had crushed enemies and signed million-dollar contracts now worked slowly, carefully at the knots. He loosened them one by one. Gentle. Precise. He never once looked back at Soo-jin. Behind them, Soo-jin had risen from the sofa. The silk of her red gown rustled sharply as she stepped forward. "Musiak, listen to me," she said quickly. Her voice was climbing again, regaining its sharp defensive edge. She was hiding things. Her finger pointed toward Lillian. "She has the ledger." Her breathing grew faster. "I was doing this for us, for the family name, for your empire." Her eyes burned with frustration. "She's a liability, a ghost from a past you should have buried years ago." The final knot fell loose. The rope slid to the floor with a dull thump. Musiak stood slowly, unfolding to his full height. He turned toward his wife. And in that moment, Soo-jin finally understood something she had spent months refusing to see. The man standing before her was not the husband she thought she had married. There was no warmth left in his eyes. No affection. No hesitation. Only a terrifying calm. The calm of a man delivering a sentence. "You speak of family," Musiak said quietly. His voice was low, so low it seemed to vibrate through the glass windows of the penthouse. "But you don't even know what the word means." He stepped closer. "You didn't marry a businessman, Soo-jin." His eyes darkened. "You married the boy this woman saved." He gestured slightly toward Lillian. "And you just tried to destroy the only part of me that was still human." The words hit the room like a blade. Musiak reached slowly into his pocket and pulled out his phone. His thumb hovered over a small black icon on the screen. "D-Sung and Min-ho are already in the basement," he said calmly. "They chose your money." His gaze hardened. "Now they'll choose how they want to disappear." Soo-jin's face went pale. Musiak's eyes traveled slowly over the red silk of her dress. Then back to her trembling hands. "And as for you..." A long pause filled the room. "I hope you enjoyed that wine." His voice dropped even lower. "Because it's the last taste of luxury you will ever have." The storm Lillian had warned about had finally arrived. And there was nowhere left for Soo-jin to hide. The air inside the penthouse changed. Just minutes earlier, the room had been thick with Soo-jin's arrogance, her quiet certainty that she controlled everything inside these walls. Now it was cold. Deadly cold. Then the elevator chimed again. The sound echoed through the marble hallway like a warning bell. The doors slid open. But this time, it wasn't the hesitant return of a husband. It was the arrival of something far more final. Heavy boots stepped onto the marble floor. One after another. 12 men entered the living room in disciplined silence. They wore the charcoal tactical gear of Han Musiak's Shadow Guard, the elite unit that protected the inner circle of his empire. Their movements were precise, almost mechanical, the result of years spent serving one man without question. None of them glanced at the penthouse decor. Not the sculptures. Not the chandeliers. Not the million-dollar art on the walls. Their eyes went straight to Musiak. And in perfect unison, their heads dipped slightly. A silent acknowledgement. Their true master had returned. Behind them, 2 figures were dragged forward roughly. Min-ho. D-Sung. The 2 men who had once stood guard at the door. The 2 men who had accepted Soo-jin's money. Their earlier confidence was gone. Stripped away the moment they stepped into the room and saw Musiak standing beside Lillian. Their faces had gone pale. Their breathing shallow. Because every man in this world knew one thing. There were many crimes inside the syndicate. But betrayal of family was the only one that had no forgiveness. Across the room, Soo-jin staggered back a step. Her composure shattered. "Musiak, please," she gasped. Her hand trembled as she fumbled for her phone. "My father, my brothers, they won't stand for this." Her voice grew desperate. "You know the alliance between our families is the only thing keeping the Morellos from moving against you." She pointed toward him, her voice rising. "If you touch me, you start a war with the Park family." Musiak didn't blink. He didn't react. He simply looked at her with an expression so calm it was almost terrifying. Then he spoke. "Call them." The words landed like stones. Soo-jin froze. Musiak nodded slowly toward the phone in her hand. "Call your father." His voice remained flat. "Tell him exactly what you did to the woman who raised me." For a moment, Soo-jin hesitated. Then panic overpowered her. Her fingers moved quickly across the screen. The phone rang. Once, twice, 3 times. In the silent penthouse, every ring echoed. Then the line connected. A deep, composed voice answered. Park Sang-hoon, patriarch of the Park family. Father, Soo-jin cried immediately, relief flooding her voice. Musiak has lost his mind. Her words tumbled out in frantic bursts. He's threatening me. He's brought his guards. Send the men. Send everyone now. The room held its breath. For several seconds, there was only silence from the other end. Then her father finally spoke. But his voice didn't carry anger or urgency, only distance. Cold, calculating distance. Soo-jin. The way he said her name felt like a judgment. Musiak contacted me 10 minutes ago. Soo-jin's face went still. Her father continued. He sent photographs. A pause. Of Lillian Carter. The words felt heavier than anything that had come before. You were instructed to manage your husband's household. His tone hardened. Not to desecrate his blood. Soo-jin's lips parted, but no sound came out. The Park family does not protect those who choose to destroy themselves, her father said calmly. Another pause. You are on your own. Click. The call ended. The phone slipped from Soo-jin's hand. It hit the hardwood floor with a sharp crack. The sound echoed through the room. For several seconds, she simply stood there. Because the realization was worse than death. Her family hadn't just refused to help her. They had abandoned her. Sacrificed her. To protect themselves from the storm she had unleashed. They feared Musiak more than they loved their own daughter. Slowly, Musiak stepped forward. His shadow fell across her like a curtain closing. Up close, he no longer looked like the husband she had manipulated for months. He didn't even look like a man anymore. He looked like something ancient. A force of judgment. The embodiment of the Great Purge that had once wiped out half the syndicates of Chicago. Min-ho. D-sung. The two traitors jerked upright instantly. Musiak's voice was calm again. Too calm. Take her to the basement. Soo-jin's breath caught. Musiak continued. Since she values the Park family name so much. His eyes hardened. She can spend her final hours reflecting on why it wasn't enough to save her. The shadow guard moved forward immediately. Hands grabbed Soo-jin's arms. Her composure finally shattered. No, please, Musiak. Her screams filled the penthouse as they dragged her toward the elevator. She kicked, struggled, begged, but none of the guards hesitated. Their faces remained expressionless. Because every man in that room understood one rule above all others. In Han Musiak's world, there was no sin greater than betraying his mother. The elevator doors closed. The screaming faded. Silence returned to the penthouse. Lillian slowly reached out and took Musiak's hand. Her touch was warm, steady, the only thing anchoring him to the light. Because without it, the storm inside him might never stop. The heavy, bulletproof glass of the Chicago penthouse was 1,000 miles behind them now. In its place stood something far quieter, something gentler. The sharp scent of polished marble and cold steel had been replaced by the soft fragrance of damp soil, blooming jasmine, and freshly cut grass drifting through the warm air of a quiet Georgia suburb. Here there were no armed guards, no encrypted cameras, no whispered conversations about territory or power. Only the slow rhythm of ordinary life. Crickets chirped lazily in the shade of tall oak trees, their branches swaying softly in the afternoon breeze. A white wooden porch wrapped around the small house like an embrace, its rocking chairs creaking gently whenever the wind passed through. Inside the modest kitchen, sunlight spilled across the wooden floorboards in warm golden stripes. The room was simple. A wooden table, a worn stove, a small window that looked out onto a backyard garden. But for the first time in years, the air felt light. Han Musiak stood at the stove. The expensive navy suits that once defined him were gone. In their place, he wore a simple linen shirt with the sleeves pushed up past his elbows. The transformation would have shocked anyone who had known him in Chicago. The most feared man in the city now looked like a man learning how to breathe again. His brow was furrowed in deep concentration as he stared down at a small, weathered index card resting beside the stove. The handwriting was faded, the corners bent from years of use. A recipe. Lillian Carter's recipe. Musiak stirred the pan carefully, watching the garlic sizzle in olive oil like it was the most delicate operation he had ever performed. Musiak, Lillian's voice called from across the kitchen. Warm. Playful. You're going to burn that garlic if you don't keep it moving. She sat at the small breakfast table near the window, snapping fresh green beans into a ceramic bowl. The bruises that once darkened her skin had faded now, leaving behind only the strength in her eyes. Her movements were calm, unhurried, peaceful. Musiak quickly stirred the pan again. I followed the instructions, Mama, he said defensively. It said 3 cloves. Lillian chuckled softly. The sound filled the room like music. Recipes are just suggestions, son, she said, shaking her head. You cook with your heart. She raised one eyebrow playfully. You ruled an empire, but you're scared of a little seasoning. Musiak glanced over his shoulder. And for a moment, the hard edges of the old Mafia boss disappeared completely. A genuine, boyish grin spread across his face, the same smile he had worn years ago when he sat in the back booth of a diner in Bronzeville. I'm not ruled by the syndicate anymore, Mama, he said. He gestured toward the stove. I'm ruled by this kitchen now. It was the truth. After that night in the penthouse, something inside him had finally broken free. The endless cycle of power, the violence, the cold calculations that had ruled his life for years. He had dismantled it all. The empire, the networks, the offshore accounts. The hand name that once terrified half the city had been quietly erased from the underworld. Not out of fear, but out of understanding. Because Musiak had realized something that power had hidden from him for years. Power meant nothing if the person who gave you your life couldn't live it in peace. He lifted the tasting spoon to his lips, closed his eyes. The flavors settled slowly across his tongue. Garlic, salt, a little too much pepper. But beneath it all, something deeper. Soul. It tasted like the back booth of a diner in Bronzeville. Like rainy afternoons. Like second chances. How is it? Lillian asked, tilting her head. Musiak opened his eyes. Then he turned off the stove. He carried the plate carefully to the table and knelt beside her chair, just as he had the night he found her tied to that wooden chair in Chicago. But this time, there were no ropes, no fear, only warmth. It's almost as good as yours, he said quietly. Lillian took the fork and tasted the food. She chewed thoughtfully, closed her eyes. Then she nodded slowly. A proud smile touched her lips. You turned out all right, boy, she said softly. You turned out just fine. Outside, the wind moved gently through the oak trees. The afternoon sun drifted slowly across the porch. And in the quiet peace of that Georgia kitchen, the Mafia boss who once ruled Chicago was gone. All that remained was a mother, a son, and a Sunday dinner that no one would ever interrupt again. The fall of Han Musiak's empire reminds us that power without loyalty is empty, and betrayal within a home is the deepest wound of all. True strength isn't domination, it's protecting the people who loved you before the world feared you. Family, gratitude, and honor will always outlive wealth, titles, and power. If this story moved you, share your thoughts in the comments. What lesson stayed with you most? Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this story with someone who believes loyalty and love still matter. Your support helps us bring more powerful stories like this to life.